Hey there, viewers. If every celebrity's private calls suddenly leaked, who do you think would have the darkest secrets exposed? Drop your bets in the comments. I'm curious who's at the top of your list, because today, Diddy's secret prison calls just surfaced, and what he said will leave you stunned. Let's get into it. Chapter 1: The Strange Visitor Log. Been doing this job long enough to know when something's out of place. Working night shifts at MDC Brooklyn doesn't come with much excitement, not the kind you'd imagine anyway. My desk is buried at the far end of a concrete hallway, tucked between two buzzing fluorescent lights that flicker so often I've stopped noticing. The office smells like a mix of burnt coffee and old paper. File cabinets crammed with forms, paperwork, call logs, visitor lists. I handle the routine checks, nothing glamorous, nothing you'd brag about. But everything runs through people like me. Every night, same drill. Verify the logs, make sure no unauthorized names are slipping into the visitation list. Cross-check the outgoing call records. If it's a legal call, it's exempt. Those don't get flagged. Everything else? It's recorded, filed, and stored. MDC policy, no exceptions. That night, though, something small tripped me up. It started with a flagged entry. I've seen hundreds before. Wrong numbers, attempts to sneak in three-way calls, inmates trying to bend the rules. Usually it's mundane. Family calls, friends, a girlfriend here and there. The flagged ones normally pop up because the number wasn't pre-approved or there's something irregular. But this one had a different kind of weight to it. I pulled up the record, routine as always, expecting another cousin or buddy who forgot to submit the paperwork. Instead, the number traced back to a contact not tied to any family member, not even to a legal rep. No, this one looked eerily familiar, not because it showed up before, but because of who it belonged to. We're not supposed to Google while on duty, but nobody watches the clerks at this hour. Curiosity got the better of me. I typed in the area code first, then the full number. It didn't take long for a few connected names to surface. It wasn't just any number. It was linked, loosely but clearly, to someone in the entertainment business, high profile. Someone whose name's been thrown around more times than I can count in media headlines, always surrounded by some controversy or another. For a moment, I sat back in my chair, letting it sink in. This wasn't a family member. It wasn't his lawyer. It wasn't some random friend from back in the day. Yet here it was, buried in the call logs, sitting like it belonged. I glanced over the entry again. The duration wasn't short either, over 10 minutes logged. Enough time for more than a quick check-in, and even more strange, this wasn't the first time the numbers showed up. It had slipped through 3 separate times in the last month. That shouldn't have happened. The call approval process is strict here, especially with someone like Sean Combs sitting behind bars. High-profile inmates get watched closer than the rest. Every name they submit is combed through. Background checks, connections, any hint of impropriety. If they want to call out, it goes through us. Nothing casual, no free-for-alls. So how did a number like that get approved? It didn't add up. Either someone upstairs gave it a pass, or it slipped past without anyone noticing. And in a place like MDC Brooklyn, things don't just slip past without a reason. I leaned forward, clicking through the attached file. There was a note from a few weeks prior, standard approval notice, nothing out of the ordinary. Whoever processed it marked it as a personal contact, no red flags. But now, seeing it again, knowing who it's tied to, it felt different. Like there was something right in front of me, but I couldn't quite figure out what. I know enough about how these things go. Calls are recorded automatically, except for legal ones. They're stored, kept out of public hands. They never get released, unless they're pulled for prosecution, and even then it's all sealed tight. No leaks. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. Yet a few days back, I caught wind of something odd floating around online. A clip. Scratchy audio. Nothing polished. Diddy's voice, unmistakable, talking to someone who sounded a hell of a lot like Kanye West. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been doctored. People fake things all the time for clicks. But now, sitting here with this log open, seeing that number staring back at me, I wasn't so sure. I scrolled back up, checking timestamps. Late night calls, usually around the same window. Always quiet hours when things calm down and fewer eyes are watching. Not impossible to sneak something through then. Not impossible at all. I double-checked the call notes again. No mention of Kanye's name, of course. Just listed as a personal contact, signed off weeks ago by one of the shift supervisors. Probably processed without thinking twice. Maybe someone unaware of the deeper connections. But it bothered me. We're trained to spot patterns, names that show up too frequently, numbers that circle back from blacklisted contacts. This wasn't sloppy paperwork. This felt deliberate. The longer I stared at the entry, the more the weight of it settled. The real question gnawed at me. How did the recording get out? I've worked here long enough to know that nothing leaks without someone pulling strings. Phone calls at MDC aren't like social media posts. They don't just leak. There's a process, a chain of custody. Someone, somewhere, either overlooked the policy or wanted this out. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something else, something sharper. What exactly did Diddy say during those calls that made someone feel it needed to see daylight? It didn't sit right. The clerk's job isn't to investigate. I'm not law enforcement. But I've seen enough to know when something's headed for trouble. High-profile inmates bring baggage. FBI raids, lawsuits, celebrities circling like vultures. Everyone's got an angle, and everyone's afraid of being the next name in the headlines. I shut the file, but my mind kept turning. The log would go through its usual processing, filed away like the thousands before it. No questions asked. That's the job. Still, I jotted the number down, tucked it away under a stack of papers. No one would notice, just in case. The lights overhead flickered again. I glanced at the clock. Another hour before the shift ended. Another night, same as the last. Except this time, something had cracked open. I leaned back in the chair, thinking about that call. Because if someone could pull a call recording from inside these walls, what else might be floating out there? Chapter 2. MDC Brooklyn's Bleak Reality. It's funny how people think fame means something behind these walls. Out there, someone like Sean Combs has the world at his feet. Private jets, entourages, red carpets. But once that steel door closes behind you at MDC Brooklyn, it all disappears. Doesn't matter how many platinum records you've sold or how many millions sit in your bank account. In here, the concrete treats everyone the same. Cold, gray, unflinching. Most people only know the surface of this place. The headlines call it a detention center, but it's more like a forgotten warehouse for bodies. Stacked, processed, left to rot while the system grinds on. The walls sweat when it rains. The lights hum loud enough to crawl under your skin. Every corner feels like it's pressing in, daring you to break. I've walked past enough cells to know the faces. Doesn't matter how you came in. Drug charges, fraud, assault. You start to look the same after a while. Hollowed out, eyes sunken. And it's not just the boredom or the lack of freedom. It's everything else that wears you down. The overcrowding's a nightmare. They pack them in, too many bodies for too few beds. Some cells meant for 2 hold 4, sometimes 5 men, sleeping head to toe on thin mattresses that sag in the middle. The air feels thick, stale, heavy with the smell of sweat, disinfectant, and something sour you can't quite place. There's no privacy, no space to think. Tensions simmer under the surface, one wrong look away from boiling over. Then there's the food. I've never been inside a cell here, but I've seen the trays. Watery beans, slimy vegetables, meat that's more fat and bone than anything edible. Some nights, the rumors go around that the kitchen's serving contaminated food again. Spoiled milk, bad meat. A few years back, one of the contractors even got slammed for it. But it's always the same story. Cut corners, save money, who cares what happens to the people inside? The heating systems don't fare much better. Come winter, the temperature drops like the sun never rose. Guards wear extra layers. Inmates wrap themselves in blankets, huddled together like animals trying to stay warm. Some wings lose heat entirely for days at a time. Complaints get filed, but repairs come slow, if at all. It's like being trapped in a freezer with no clock, no way of knowing when it'll end. And the mental strain? That's the part nobody talks about openly, but you can feel it. It presses against the walls, heavier than the air itself. There are the screams at night, some muffled, some not. Fights breaking out over nothing. Guys talking to themselves, pacing their cells like caged dogs, waiting for the hours to blur together. You'd think celebrities might have it better, but in a place like this, their isolation hits harder. No entourages, no handlers, just concrete, and the sound of their own thoughts gnawing away. It wasn't lost on anyone when Sean Combs showed up. Not every day someone like him ends up in MDC. People talk, even the guards who try to play it straight while you hear the whispers. What's he like? Is he cracking yet? Some figured he'd coast through, maybe get special treatment, but there's no VIP section in a place like this. I've seen him once or twice, not up close, enough to catch the change. The man everyone used to see polished, dressed to the nines, now grayer, beard unkempt, hair turning fully white at the temples. Some said he looked bloated, others whispered about weight loss during earlier appearances. Depends on who you ask, but either way, he's not the same as when he walked in. You can tell by the way he carries himself. Shoulders lower, eyes duller, even his posture seems heavier, like gravity's pulling harder on him. And then there was that hospital trip. Word travels fast in here, even when it's not supposed to. They tried to keep it quiet, slipping him out late at night, no public notice. But nothing stays hidden long. MRI on his knee, they said, some old injury catching up, maybe from his days running marathons, who knows. But the chatter wasn't about his knee. It was about how quick they got him out and back. No fuss, no headlines, like someone wanted to keep it all hush-hush. The staff don't talk openly about it, but we all noticed something shift after Christmas. Holidays hit hard for a lot of inmates, but for him, it seemed different. There were rumors, nothing official of course, about some kind of meltdown. Supposedly, he struggled to hold it together, pacing his cell, talking to himself. Some guards said he refused meals for a while, shut down visits. Could have been the loneliness, maybe something worse, hard to say. But when you've seen enough men break, you start to recognize the signs. And I couldn't help but think back to that call log, the number I flagged. It made more sense now, piecing it together. The strict recording system we've got in place, it's meant to prevent exactly that kind of leak. No personal calls slipping out, no conversations floating beyond these walls. But someone still managed to get that recording out, and it wasn't by accident. It's one thing to imagine an inmate calling family, checking on kids, trying to stay sane. But when someone like Diddy is reaching out to high-profile names, people outside the usual circle, it starts to paint a different picture. Maybe he wasn't just looking for comfort. Maybe he felt something closing in, enough to start pulling strings, reaching beyond the concrete, beyond the layers of steel and policy. The thing is, MDC doesn't care who you are. The environment breaks everyone down the same way, slow and methodical. You can't buy your way out of cold nights, bad food, or the weight of silence pressing in. And from where I'm sitting, seeing how these calls are starting to slip through the cracks, how his appearance keeps shifting, gray hair, slumped shoulders, eyes hollow, I don't think fame's going to save him. What keeps gnawing at me, though, is what's happening behind the scenes. That leak wasn't a mistake. Someone wanted people outside to hear it. Maybe to send a message, maybe as a warning, or maybe just because even behind concrete walls, some voices refuse to stay buried. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever's brewing, whatever he said during those calls, it's only the beginning. Chapter 3, the unofficial recording. You hear things in a place like this. Things that shouldn't be said, shouldn't be shared, but still find their way through the cracks. Working security at MDC Brooklyn long enough teaches you that. I've done more than my fair share of shifts, seen enough faces come and go, enough high-profile names get stripped down to just another inmate number. And over time you start tuning out the usual noise, the gossip, the wild theories, the ridiculous rumors the younger staff like to pass around to kill time between rounds. Most of it's nothing, until it isn't. That night, I was making my usual circuit, graveyard shift, lights dimmed low, most of the facility dead quiet save for the occasional muttering from the cells. A couple of new recruits were posted at one of the staff checkpoints, slumped over their paperwork, pretending to focus. I was about to keep walking past when I caught the edge of their conversation, hushed, leaning in, like they didn't want anyone else to hear. One of them mentioned Diddy's name, which isn't unusual around here. His presence alone keeps the chatter going, and every few weeks there's some new theory about who visited him or what legal team stunt he's pulling. But it was the next part that made me pause. They were talking about a phone call, a recording, something that had gotten out. At first I didn't give it much weight. I've been here long enough to know better. Every single non-legal call is recorded. It's policy. Everything's logged, reviewed if necessary, but never under any circumstances released publicly. That's the whole point. We're not in the business of airing inmates' personal conversations unless the courts drag them out. So a leaked call? That's not how this place operates. But they weren't speculating, they were treating it like fact. I lingered just a little longer, letting them talk while pretending to check the logs on my clipboard. One of them mentioned hearing the audio. Scratchy, rough, like it had been passed around too many times already. Diddy's voice, unmistakable, they said, talking to someone who sounded an awful lot like Kanye West. Not the typical small talk or family check-in either. No, according to them, it was something darker, a warning. Something about people trying to end us. Normally I would have written it off, chalked it up to bored kids embellishing, reading too much into rumors circulating online. But the more they talked, the more I caught a different tone. They'd heard from someone higher up, one of the admin clerks, maybe even someone in the recording office, that the call was real. Not some AI nonsense, not a deepfake cooked up for clicks. Real. The source confirmed it plain as day. That stuck with me. See, once something official leaves MDC, there's a trail. Everything gets logged, accounted for. Calls don't just float into the public without someone somewhere making it happen. And if it's tied to a prosecution, there's even more red tape. But this? No court case yet, no subpoenas. So how did a recording like that end up floating around? I kept my head down, finished my round, but I couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at me. When I got back to the break room, I figured I'd check. Nothing official in the reports. No mention of any leak, no disciplinary notices. Nothing unusual logged. Everything looked clean. But anyone who's worked here knows the paperwork only tells part of the story. It took a few more days before the chatter made its way to me again. This time, one of the overnight shift guys, someone I'd known long enough to trust, caught me by the lockers. He didn't say much, just slipped me a cheap set of earbuds and told me to give something a listen. I waited until later back in my car, engine running, windows rolled up. Didn't want anyone catching wind. Plugged them in, pulled up the file he sent. It was short, barely over a minute. The audio wasn't great, like it had been recorded from a phone off someone else's speaker. But the voice? No question who it was. Diddy. You could hear the fatigue in his words, like the weight of the walls was pressing down on every sentence. He wasn't yelling, wasn't even raising his voice. Just low, quiet, deliberate. And the lines stuck out clear. Be careful. There's people trying to end us. It wasn't the words themselves that got me. It was the way he said it. Clipped, paranoid, almost like he knew the call wasn't private but couldn't help himself. Then came the other voice, harder to make out but familiar enough, laughing a little, brushing it off, telling him to lighten up, get back to music, something like that. You didn't need context to piece together who it was. It matched the chatter. The name floating around attached to the leak, Kanye West. But what threw me wasn't just the fact that Diddy had made the call. It was knowing that number never should have been cleared. See, every outgoing call has to be tied to an approved contact list. We keep those tight, especially for inmates like him. Family legal reps, maybe one or two personal contacts who pass background checks. Not celebrities, not public figures known for attracting media storms, and definitely not anyone outside the regular vetted circle. Yet there it was. That conversation happened, which meant somewhere along the line, someone signed off on the number. I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it added up. Diddy's been under watch since day one. Every move scrutinized, every visitor checked. How does a call like that get approved, recorded, and then somehow leak out? Not through official channels, that's for damn sure. The deeper question kept digging into me. Why now? Why that particular call? I know enough about how the system works to understand things don't happen by accident. Someone wanted that conversation heard, whether it was to send a message, stir up headlines, or warn someone on the outside. That's the part I couldn't figure out. I replayed the snippet again, listening closer. There was something off in Diddy's voice, something brittle beneath the words, like a man who'd been backed into a corner, stripped of everything that kept him above water. The words sounded paranoid, sure, but more than that, they felt like the kind of thing you say when you know something's coming and there's nothing you can do to stop it. By the next shift, more guards were murmuring about it. No official statement, no crackdown, but everyone was on edge. You could feel it in the air. The kind of tension that crawls under your skin, makes you wonder what else might leak next. I kept it to myself mostly, but part of me couldn't stop running through the possibilities. Diddy wasn't some low-level inmate trying to sneak in a call to an old friend. He knew how tightly the system's locked down. He knew those calls are recorded, filed, never supposed to leave. So either he didn't care who might hear, or he wanted someone to. And as for who let it slide, I didn't have an answer. Could have been someone upstairs bending the rules, maybe thinking a little goodwill could buy them something down the line. Or maybe someone had orders to let it through, no questions asked. What gnawed at me, though, was how fast the conversation spread once it was out. It wasn't just circulating inside these walls. It was making the rounds outside, on social media, whispered about in the entertainment corners, popping up in headlines questioning how real it was. And the fact that an inside source confirmed the leak's authenticity? That sealed it. Diddy's warning wasn't meant to be locked away. Someone made sure it wouldn't be. I sat in the staff room at the end of my shift, the hum of the vending machine filling the silence. The rest of the guys clocked out without a word, but my mind was still circling back to that voice, those words. People trying to end us. What was he really trying to say, and who else on the outside had been listening long before we were? Chapter 4. Hollywood's Panic. It didn't take long for the ripple to reach outside these walls. Word spreads fast in a place like MDC, sure, but it spreads even faster in the circles that orbit men like Sean Combs. And once that call, or even pieces of it, began floating online, it was like tossing a stone into a still pond. You could feel the ripple getting wider, touching places far beyond this cold building. The thing is, people on the outside like to believe their world is untouchable, especially Hollywood. But it never is. At first, the clip seemed like just another rumor, another half-heard conversation making the rounds, another headline grabbing for attention. But when you listened close enough, when you really paid attention, you caught the exact words. Diddy's voice low, almost slurred with fatigue, telling someone, clear as day, have some fucking fun. Telling them to get behind the mic, thanking them, almost brokenly, for taking care of my kids after his September lockup. And just like that, people realized this wasn't some AI deepfake, wasn't some fan splicing sound bites for views. It was real. The media pounced on it first, as they always do, but what caught my attention wasn't the press or the bloggers circling like vultures. It was the way things shifted behind the scenes, the way certain names, certain faces started to fall silent, like someone had flipped a switch. See, Kanye West isn't exactly known for keeping things quiet. Every other week, there's some headline attached to him, some controversy he stumbled into or created himself. He's unpredictable, erratic, impossible to manage, and that's exactly why everyone was suddenly on edge. Because if Diddy's leaning on him, sharing personal, vulnerable words like that, what else is being said off the record? Who else might get dragged into the spotlight without warning? It wasn't just about the words themselves, it was about the subtext, the connections. You've got one man behind concrete walls, stripped of his empire, clinging to whatever influence he has left, and instead of reaching out quietly to lawyers or family, he's reaching out to Kanye. Not exactly the safest move, considering Kanye's history of broadcasting private business to anyone who'll listen. That's what made the whole thing feel like something bigger was brewing. Hollywood's got its own kind of paranoia. Behind the glamour and the polished interviews, it's all about control, controlling the narrative, controlling appearances. PR teams exist to keep the chaos contained, to make sure the machine keeps running smooth. But a leaked call like this, one that wasn't supposed to see daylight, one that suddenly has half the internet dissecting every word, it's the kind of thing no publicist can fix over. I started noticing how quickly certain names faded from the conversation. People who'd once been photographed at Diddy's parties, featured in glossy magazines smiling next to him, suddenly nowhere to be seen. Jay-Z, Beyoncé, Leonardo DiCaprio, Usher, all of them tied to Diddy in one way or another over the years, whether it was business deals, collaborations, or simply rubbing shoulders at the right events. But now, radio silence. No statements, no public comments, just a noticeable absence. And it wasn't hard to figure out why. The line that kept bouncing around in my head wasn't the one about fun or even the thank you about the kids. It was the other part, the one that slipped out almost like an afterthought. Be careful. There's people trying to end us. That's the kind of thing you don't say lightly, especially not when you know the call's being recorded. On the inside, you learn to listen between the lines. Everyone's watching their back, speaking in half-truths and guarded phrases. But what stood out about that call was how unguarded it was. Like Diddy wasn't even trying to hide the fact that he felt something closing in. And Hollywood's smartest players picked up on that fast. The PR scramble wasn't just about managing Diddy's image anymore. It was about self-preservation. Because if one conversation could leak, what else might be sitting on a recording somewhere? What other names might have slipped out in late-night calls, cryptic enough to send reporters digging but clear enough to make people nervous? The whispers reached further than I expected. Even among the guards, people started speculating. Who was next? Was there another clip waiting to surface? Every new shift brought fresh theories. Some saying Diddy was trying to warn people off before the trial heated up. Others convinced he was sending coded messages to his allies, maybe even threatening to drag others down with him if things went south. It was like watching a house of cards tremble. One phone call, one leak, and suddenly everyone's wondering how much of their past might come back to bite them. Kanye, of course, didn't help matters. He's not the type to stay quiet, even when silence would serve him better. His own history is littered with outbursts, feuds, public meltdowns, the last person anyone wanted holding sensitive information. But Diddy trusted him enough to make the call anyway, to drop those lines knowing full well they could end up plastered across every headline. That's what made the silence from everyone else feel even louder. You'd think, given how careful most of these celebrities are, that they'd come out swinging, deny everything, spin the narrative, but instead, it was like a wall went up. No public statements, no denials, just strategic distance, a quiet retreat, as if by staying out of sight, they could avoid whatever fallout was coming. And the more the clips circulated, the more the speculation grew. Some online threads started connecting dots that probably shouldn't be connected, pulling old photos from Diddy's parties, dissecting every guest list, trying to figure out who might have been around for the infamous nights people like to whisper about. It was all rumor, all unconfirmed, but that didn't matter. The damage was already done. I couldn't help but wonder how many of them were sitting in their mansions, scrolling through their phones, wondering if their names were next. Because once one recording gets out, the question isn't if there's more, it's when. And it struck me that maybe that was the whole point. Maybe Diddy knew exactly what he was doing when he placed that call. Maybe it wasn't just about catching up or venting to a friend. Maybe it was a reminder to anyone paying attention that even from behind bars, he still had ways to shake the ground under their feet. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense why the higher-ups at MDC clamped down so fast afterward. You don't restrict call logs and tighten access unless you're afraid of what's in them, which only added fuel to the fire. If there was nothing to hide, why seal the records? By the end of that week, you could feel the tension not just in here but everywhere. Reporters circling like sharks, Hollywood circles pulling back, insiders going quiet. It wasn't just about Diddy anymore. It was about the web of connections who knew what, who might have been caught on tape, who was trying to scrub their name clean before the next leak dropped. And all because of one call that was never supposed to see the light of day. It's funny how fast things unravel when control slips through your fingers. One voice, one message, and suddenly the people who seemed untouchable are scrambling to cover their tracks. I sat at my desk during the next shift, staring at the screen, flipping through call logs without really reading them. I knew whatever storm had started wasn't finished yet. Because if Diddy was willing to let that call leak, what else did he have waiting in the dark? Chapter 5. Health Rumors. By the time the focus swung back to Diddy himself, it wasn't just the whispers in here or the frantic scrambling out in Hollywood. The man had been silent, at least publicly, for months now. But the court appearances, those can't be avoided. And when he finally showed up, standing before the judge, it wasn't the same figure people had grown used to seeing on stages, on glossy magazine covers, or striding through red carpets surrounded by flashing lights. The cameras caught him, even if only for a moment, long enough for people to notice what the guards and staff here had been observing for weeks. He looked different, bloated, heavier in some ways, but aged, unnaturally so. His beard, once meticulously trimmed and black as ink, had gone fully gray, like someone had drained the color straight from his face overnight. His hair followed suit, patches of stark white at his temples that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just aging, it was something else, something more brittle, hollowed out, as if all the pressure pressing down on him was showing through his skin. I watched the footage later that night, sitting in the staff room long after my shift, sound turned low. He barely lifted his chin when the cameras flicked on, shoulders slumped in a way that told you he knew exactly how he looked and didn't care to fix it. It hit me how far he'd fallen from the man people used to see on TV. Months earlier, reports described him as astonishingly thinner, almost gaunt, the weight of mounting charges and public scrutiny dragging at him. Now, though, the narrative flipped. The media compared him to Santa Claus, bloated, gray-bearded, almost unrecognizable. But the way I saw it, it wasn't about weight gain or loss. It was the kind of transformation stress carves into a person. And the more those images circulated, the more the internet lit up. Speculation didn't take long to bubble up. It never does when someone that high-profile looks visibly altered. Threads popped up dissecting everything, his posture, his complexion, the puffiness around his eyes. People threw around words like frail and sickly, and before long, unconfirmed whispers started surfacing again. The same rumors I'd heard floating around the staff room weeks earlier crept back online. Unverified claims about an HIV diagnosis, always prefaced with allegedly, but persistent enough to get attention. No solid proof, nothing concrete, but enough smoke to keep people watching, waiting for confirmation that never came. It wasn't hard to see why the rumors stuck. A man doesn't go gray overnight without something gnawing at him, especially not someone who spent decades carefully curating how the world saw him. Diddy had always been sharp, clean-cut, the picture of control. Now, between the frailty and the hospital visits, people started wondering how much was breaking down beneath the surface. That hospital trip, the one the staff whispered about weeks back, only added fuel to the fire. They slipped him out late at night, no press alert, no statement. A quiet MRI on his knee, they said, an old injury flaring up. But it felt off, too discreet, too clean. Most inmates don't get that kind of treatment unless something's serious. And if you knew how this place usually operates, you'd know there's rarely such urgency for routine checkups. By then, he'd already been through the ringer, the lawsuits piling up, multiple women accusing him of assault and coercion, lawsuits spanning years, the FBI raids where agents stormed through his homes, seizing everything from narcotics to firearms, tearing apart whatever veneer of luxury he had left. Each headline chipped away at whatever control he had, leaving more cracks in his public image. Then, there's the looming trial, scheduled like a ticking clock counting down, every charge stacked against him like weights on his back. Racketeering, sex trafficking, obstruction. It's the kind of storm that grinds a person down long before they ever see a verdict. And watching him shuffle into court, hearing how his voice wavered during those brief moments when he spoke, it didn't look like a man ready to fight. It looked like someone who knew the walls were closing in faster than he could brace for. The staff here noticed it too. Guards aren't supposed to care much beyond keeping order, but you can't help but see it. The way Diddy's face seemed to sink a little lower every week. How he stopped engaging during routine checks. How some days he barely touched the food trays slid through his cell door. None of us could say for sure what was happening, but it felt like watching someone unravel piece by piece. I couldn't help but think back to that phone call, the one with Kanye, that moment when he thanked him, almost too casually, for taking care of my kids after his lockup. You don't say something like that unless you feel like you're running out of chances. The way he told Kanye to have some fucking fun, to get behind the mic. It didn't sound like advice. It sounded like the kind of thing a man says when he's got nothing left to lose. And maybe that's exactly why he placed the call when he did. Maybe he knew his health wasn't going to hold up, that whatever was wearing him down wouldn't give him much longer to play defense. Maybe it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about making sure certain things didn't stay buried with him. Rumors swirled about mental health evaluations, about requests for psychiatric check-ins. Nobody could confirm much, but the whispers grew louder, especially after Christmas. Everyone heard about the so-called meltdown, how he shut down, refused visits, withdrew into himself. That's not uncommon around the holidays. A lot of men in here spiral when December hits. But for Diddy, it seemed deeper, like the weight of everything finally caught up. People like him aren't used to losing control, not on this level. When the system starts stripping you down, your power, your reputation, your physical health, it's not just your body that cracks, your mind follows. Every shift, I found myself wondering how much more he had in him. Whether this was part of a slow breakdown, or if the man everyone used to see had already checked out, leaving only the hollowed shell behind. And watching the media tear into his appearance, dissecting his graying beard, his bloated frame, it felt like they were missing the bigger picture. This wasn't about how he looked. It was about what those changes meant. a man unraveling under the weight of years of secrets, scandals, and now, the inescapable reality of facing it all head-on. That call with Kanye didn't sound like desperation at first, but now, replaying it in my mind, it felt different. It felt like a warning shot, a last-ditch attempt to reach out before the walls finally closed all the way. And as I sat in the break room, staring at those court photos plastered across the news, I couldn't shake the thought. If the man standing there looked like that now, what else was about to fall apart? Chapter 6. The List. Everyone fears. The longer you work in a place like MDC, the more you realize that what happens behind the scenes is never as simple as the paperwork makes it out to be. The files, the logs, the reports, they tell you what you're supposed to know, what's official, but it's the quiet conversations, the sideways glances between staff, the rumors passed from one shift to the next that really show you what's brewing beneath the surface. And lately those whispers had taken on a sharper edge. It wasn't just about the leaked phone call anymore. It wasn't even just about Diddy's deteriorating appearance or the media frenzy outside. Inside these walls, people were starting to murmur about something far more dangerous, something no one dared mention outright, but everyone seemed to sense: a list. It started small, like it always does. A casual remark overheard during a meal break, a guard offhandedly mentioning something they'd heard from an admin clerk. No one wanted to say it too loud, but the word was out. There might be more than just that one phone call floating around. More recordings, more files, and not just calls to family or lawyers. Names, specific ones. Ones powerful enough to make people nervous. The thing is, rumors about Diddy keeping records weren't new. They'd been floating around long before he ever stepped foot inside MDC. Stories about the infamous parties he used to throw, the so-called freak-offs everyone whispered about but never openly discussed. High-profile names, celebrities, executives, all mingling behind closed doors where no cameras were allowed. Everyone assumed there were no receipts. That's how people like Diddy operated. Keep it private, keep it controlled. But after the FBI raids, those old rumors took on a new weight. People here talked about what the agents found when they hit his homes. AR-15s, narcotics, hard drives, security footage. Things you don't just keep lying around unless you've got a reason. No one knew exactly what was on those drives. The public only heard vague mentions, weapons, drugs, digital evidence tied to the charges stacking up against him. But the staff here, the ones who've seen how these cases unfold, couldn't help but wonder what else the feds might have stumbled across. And that's where the list started coming back into focus. The logic wasn't hard to follow. A man like Diddy doesn't get to where he is without keeping leverage. Maybe it's insurance. Maybe it's control. Either way, the idea that he'd kept detailed records, names, dates, attendees, didn't seem so far-fetched once you saw how much he'd lost. The walls were closing in fast, and everyone knew that when powerful men start to fall, they don't like to fall alone. What made it worse was the timing. That leaked call with Kanye, cryptic as it was, seemed almost like a warning, not just to Kanye, but to anyone listening. The way he told him to be careful, talked about people trying to end us. It didn't sound like idle paranoia. It sounded like someone who knew what kind of fire he was sitting on, and who might get burned if it spilled out. MDC's policies are clear. Every non-legal call is recorded, stored away, locked down, supposedly untouchable unless pulled for prosecution. And yet, somehow, that call had slipped through. Someone, somewhere, wanted it out, which begged the question, how many other calls like that existed, and how many people out there were wondering if their names had been mentioned? The guards weren't the only ones whispering about it. Even some of the clerical staff, the ones who usually keep their heads down, started double-checking records, re-reviewing approved contact lists, quietly flagging any patterns that didn't add up. It felt like everyone was waiting for another shoe to drop. What unsettled me most was how quickly people outside these walls started reacting. You could see it online. Threads dissecting old photos, pointing out who used to show up at Diddy's events, who shared business ties, who had been conspicuously silent since the leaks started. Celebrities who once bragged about their connections suddenly going dark. No statements, no public shows of support, just silence. Because if Diddy really did have a list, if those hard drives seized during the raids contained more than just financial records or promotional materials, then every one of those names had reason to be nervous, especially knowing that he wasn't in control anymore, that every call he made, every word he spoke, could be used against him. And the worse his health seemed to get, the more that fear grew. The talk about his knee giving out, about his hospital trips, the psychiatric evaluations nobody wanted to officially confirm, it all fed into the same unease. He looked like a man unraveling, like someone who might not have much left to lose. And when men like that feel cornered, they start pulling everyone else down with them. It was hard not to wonder what he might be willing to trade if things got worse, if the trial date got closer, if another lawsuit hit, if the walls pressed in just a little tighter. Would he start talking? Would he let more calls slip out, just like that one with Kane? Would names get dropped, not out of malice, but out of sheer survival instinct? That's what had people here tense, the idea that it wasn't over, that maybe what had leaked so far was just the beginning. You could see it in the way certain files started getting restricted. Call logs that used to be routine suddenly marked confidential. Guards being reassigned without explanation. Discussions about visitor approvals getting kicked up to higher levels, no longer left to the usual chain of command. It wasn't official, no memos, no policy changes, but everyone felt it. And outside these walls, the panic only grew louder. PR teams scrambling, past associates keeping their heads down, news outlets speculating about who might get dragged into the mess next. Everyone trying to pretend they weren't watching the slow-motion collapse, even as they quietly distanced themselves. What struck me most was how quiet Diddy himself had become. No statements, no attempts to refute the leaks, no legal teams out front trying to spin the narrative. It was like he knew there was no point, like he was waiting too. The idea of a list wasn't just some conspiracy cooked up to sell headlines. It was a question hanging over everything now, one nobody wanted answered, because the answer meant more than just scandal. It meant careers ruined, reputations shattered, legal lines crossed. And here, in the concrete halls of MDC, where every word is recorded, every call cataloged, every face stripped of pretense, it felt like the one place where the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. I found myself checking the logs more carefully after that. Not because I expected to see something obvious, but because the more pieces you see slipping out, the more you start wondering how many others are quietly being moved, sealed away, kept from prying eyes. If Diddy really did have names tucked away, whether on paper, on drives, or buried in the conversations he's been having behind these walls, then it was only a matter of time before someone else pulled them into the light. And by then, it wouldn't just be one man's fault. Everyone was watching. It would be the collapse of something much bigger. Chapter 7. Public Fallout. Once a leak starts, it's almost impossible to control where it spreads. Inside the walls of MDC, we saw it first. The tightening protocols, the nervous glances, the sudden restrictions slapped on files that had been routine for months. But outside, where appearances matter more than truth, the fallout hit in waves. It didn't just affect Diddy or the people on the inside. The shock traveled through everyone connected to him, and it was clear, even from my desk buried under concrete and fluorescent lights, that Hollywood was scrambling to figure out how to respond. The first real crack came not from Diddy's camp, but from Cassie Ventura. People like to pretend social media posts don't mean much, that celebrities sharing cryptic messages are just venting, detached from reality, but anyone paying attention caught the timing. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. She just reposted something sharp, pointed, telling certain people, certain supporters, to shut the FK up. It didn't take long for people to draw the connection. Cassie had been in headlines months earlier, filing lawsuits, speaking about the kind of control and abuse she claimed Diddy subjected her to. So, when Kanye West's voice surfaced, laughing off Diddy's cryptic warnings, brushing it all aside, it wasn't hard to see who she was addressing. The public grabbed onto it fast. Threads exploded, dissecting every interaction. Cassie's riposte, Kanye's loyalty, the timing of Diddy's call. The words he'd used in the call haunted the conversation. Taking care of my kids. That line kept circling, picked apart by commentators, journalists, fans. What exactly did he mean by it? It wasn't just a thank you. It felt too personal, too intimate, like something more was being said beneath the surface. Questions multiplied. Why was Diddy leaning so heavily on Kanye, a man known for his unpredictability? Why would he trust him enough to speak so openly, knowing full well the call would be recorded, stored, and potentially used against him? Theories stacked up online, some suggesting Kanye was acting as a middleman, passing messages to others who couldn't risk direct contact. Others speculated Diddy felt cornered enough to cling to the few people still willing to speak to him, no matter how risky. But beneath all the noise, something quieter started happening. You didn't need to be a journalist to notice it. The public faces, the ones who used to post photos with Diddy, shout him out at award shows, casually mention past collaborations. Those faces went silent. No statements, no public displays of support. Not outright denials either, which almost made it worse. Just a strategic retreat, like distance itself was the only way to avoid the splash. PR teams worked overtime. You could see it in the shifts. Sudden unfollowings on social media, projects quietly restructured, interviews edited to remove any mention of him. The entertainment machine moved quickly when it sensed blood in the water, and Diddy's name had become too volatile to touch. But the division didn't stop there. The public itself fractured. Some dug in their heels, defending Diddy, spinning the narrative that the system was gunning for him, another powerful black man torn down by media and legal traps. Others pointed to the mounting lawsuits, the steady stream of accusations, and now the unguarded vulnerability in that leaked call as proof that his empire wasn't built on as solid ground as people liked to believe. It was the kind of fracture you could feel even from inside MDC. Guards talked about it, speculating between rounds, passing headlines back and forth like trading cards. Who else would speak out? Who else might distance themselves before it got worse? And who would stay loyal, no matter how dangerous that loyalty became? But the real weight hung on what hadn't surfaced yet. Because every day that passed, new whispers cropped up. Talk of more recordings, more calls stored away. Not officially released, not public, but known. Conversations with other celebrities, other figures who had once felt untouchable. No names confirmed, no tapes leaked, but the idea alone was enough to keep people on edge. Inside, the atmosphere thickened. You could feel it in the way the staff carried themselves, checking and rechecking logs, watching the admin offices tighten their grip on who accessed what. No one wanted to be the person who missed the next leak, who let something else slip through the cracks. Outside, the same energy echoed. Hollywood insiders allegedly working overtime to bury past connections, journalists digging deeper trying to unearth any breadcrumbs that might hint at who was next. Every old photo, every party guest list, every business deal tied back to Diddy became a potential liability. The court of public opinion wavered, shifting day by day. Defenders grew quieter, critics grew louder, and in between, the unease spread like a shadow, stretching over anyone who had ever stood too close. Because at the heart of it all was the same question. If one call had surfaced, how many others were sitting in silence, waiting? Chapter 8. The Final Call and Sealed Records. It was subtle at first. The kind of shift you might not notice if you weren't already paying attention, if you didn't have a habit of double-checking the small things. I'd been back at my desk for a week after the initial chaos of the leaked call had seemed to die down, slipping back into routine, logs, approvals, the usual shuffle of paperwork that kept the system running smooth on the surface. But something was different, something I couldn't quite name, at least not at first. The file access felt slower. Systems that usually took seconds to load now hung longer, requesting additional authorization where there hadn't been any before. It wasn't flagged as a new protocol, no official memo sent out about tightened controls, but I could see it plainly whenever I keyed in Diddy's inmate number. Where before I'd been able to pull up his call logs, visitor lists, basic tracking sheets without friction, now there was a lock on all of it. Not the usual security clearances, those we dealt with daily, but something higher. At first I thought maybe it was temporary, maybe they were reorganizing, filtering files for legal purposes, but day after day the same block stood firm. Even the supervisors, the ones usually willing to bend the rules or offer an explanation if you asked right, avoided the topic. It didn't take long for word to spread among staff. Quiet conversations in the break room hinted at what I'd already figured out. Access to Diddy's logs wasn't just tightened, it was shut down. No routine reviews, no cross-checking approvals. Locked, airtight. And no one was offering any explanation why. That's when I noticed the shift in the guard rotations, too. One of the regular night guys, the same one who'd first slipped me that recording, disappeared from the lineup. Reassigned, they said. No fuss, no announcement, just gone. Another guard picked up his shifts without comment. When I asked around, the response was always the same. A shrug, a shake of the head, nothing concrete. But everyone knew what had happened. The leak hadn't just stirred up headlines, it had spooked the higher-ups enough to clamp down hard, harder than usual, and once MDC decides to lock something away, it doesn't matter how long you've worked there or how much routine access you're used to having. Doors close, files vanish, the chain tightens. The thing is, none of this happens unless there's something worth hiding. It wasn't just about covering up the leak. If that's all it had been, the system would have handled it quietly. Disciplinary action, a memo about following protocols, maybe a few files scrubbed from the public queue. But this felt deliberate, like they were bracing for something bigger. I caught wind of a few hushed conversations between admin staff, whispers that there'd been more calls flagged than the one everyone knew about. Nothing concrete, no details on who the other recipients were, but enough to raise questions. If Diddy's conversation with Kanye had slipped out, how many others had come close, and who else had been listening before the locks went on? The unsettling part wasn't that we didn't know the contents of those calls, it was the fact that suddenly, no one inside the system could see them either. Legal privilege, prosecution preparation, that's the standard excuse when files disappear behind layers of clearance. But this didn't feel like standard procedure. It felt like something was being sealed away permanently, like the goal wasn't to prepare for trial, but to bury whatever else existed. No one dared say it outright, but the speculation ran deep. Maybe Diddy had said more than anyone realized. Maybe those late-night calls had dropped names far more dangerous than expected. Maybe there was more to that list, the one everyone had been murmuring about in corners, than we'd thought. And now, with his health deteriorating and the pressure mounting, the system wasn't taking any more chances. The truth is, once information starts moving, once it leaks past the walls, there's no containing it fully. You can seal records, reassign guards, scrub files from access, but the damage lingers in the spaces left behind. And standing there, staring at the blank screen where Diddy's logs used to be, I couldn't help but wonder what else had been locked away, what calls never made it into circulation, what voices got caught on tape but would never be heard outside the facility. Or worse, whether those recordings were still sitting somewhere, waiting, held like bargaining chips, ready to be played when the moment called for it. Because if there's one thing MDC teaches you, it's that silence doesn't mean absence. It just means someone's holding the key. And that's what stayed with me most as I filed out at the end of my shift, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the weight of unanswered questions pressing in. What had he said on those final calls? Who else was listening? And why, after everything, did it feel like the truth had been locked away for good?